Well, first of all, thanks for joining us today, my friend. We're honored here at Setser Group on our Barriers for Breakfast video cast that we've been doing across YouTube and LinkedIn and also Facebook to have a longtime friend and colleague, Shomari James. And he's going to talk a lot about his work at Equity Now. But, I've been looking forward to this one because all over social media, all since the election, we've been talking about the promise of charter schools, whether or not charter schools have met that promise, how people think about charter operators. And I know you have a very nuanced perspective like I do. And I want people to hear some of the ins and outs of, how we think about this national conversation. And probably one of the more exciting things is how we both value it in terms of financial equity. And I think that's a really interesting take that Equity Now has had since the inception. So we're thrilled to have you on the podcast today, Shomari. And I'd just like for you to kind of, educate our listeners about how you even came to this work. Why does it matter to you?
Thank you. I'm glad to be here, Bryan. I appreciate you, honored and humbled to be able to talk to you and your guests as well. That question is, there were a lot of other things that we could have did besides getting to this race, right?
Right.
But let me say that I'm married, father of two with a 16-year-old and a 20-year-old son. My daughter is in a charter school now. She'll be a senior, rising senior. My son is a sophomore in college. And we're at a point in our life, my wife and I, where we've seen a lot of change from moving from Buffalo, New York to the DMV area, the DC, Maryland, Virginia area. And my son, he probably went to maybe 5, 6, if not 8 different public schools. So we knew that what we wanted to do moving into starting our organization, which is Equity Now, Inc., nonprofit charter management organization, we wanted to be able to expedite change. And part of that looked like starting a school. So as a charter management organization, we have Legends Charter School, and there's 4 co-founders. It's not just myself. I have a magical team that does amazing work. So as I discuss this, if I use I statements, it's definitely not just me. But Bryan, I do this work because representation matters. And the first thing, which is not a bad thing per se, when you say representation matters, folks think about how I look, right? People of color community, Black people, BIPOC. But for me, representation also means that I was the kid in school that had average grades. I wasn't failing, but I also wasn't a superstar athlete, superstar grades, none of the above. I was kind of average in school. As well. My family, we didn't have enough income where we were rich, right? But we were too high of an income to receive public assistance, or you know what I mean? But too low for some of the things that we actually needed, right? So when I say representation matters, kind of for those that are in the middle, those children and families who can look at me, and when I tell my story, I say, hey, I wasn't a straight A student. I wasn't a failing student who turned it around and became a career athlete or superstar athlete and then came back to do this work. I'm just your everyday person. And if I can do it, so can you. Now, it's obviously for me and my community a bonus that for those who look like me, representation matters as well. But that's not the only thing, because whatever your race may be, you could still be an average student and I can represent you. So that's why I do this work.
There's so much there. When we met, I actually was working with your wife when she was at Lecky Middle School, and one of the schools that President Obama singled out. And it was at a time when I was also working in a charter management organization. And I was hearing all of these arguments about, charters are just there to make a buck and they don't care about students, and, they're not actually public schools. And a lot of those are myths, and what you have to do is kind of get into the conversation and say, okay, what's real, what's the truth, what are the facts, and now how do we make sure we have a model that works for all? Because what we experience down here in Durham is that a lot of our neighborhood either makes a decision to go to the all-white charters or to the Durham public schools. And you know a little bit about me and my background. And my wife and I talked and said, we are privileged to give our kids a lot of things, but one thing we can't give them is sort of a diverse and inclusive experience beyond our home unless we're intentional about it. So we made some decisions really early to send them to a school that had Chinese and Spanish immersion. It was across town. Our school was actually across the street, but we were really intent on exposing them to a lot of different things. So when I hear things like, you experience several different schools, and I hear things like representation, let's dig a little deeper on what are some of the myths in your mind that people don't understand about what you do at Equity Now and at Legends? And then, what are some things that are challenges? And let's unpack them a little bit.
That's a great question. And as always, Bryan, I applaud you for that, right? Because what happens oftentimes, just as people, but especially as parents, we can't get past our own limitations, and then we push them on our children, right? So I applaud you for that work. And we tried as best as we could, Atasha and I, to do the same thing to help them to get those experiences. But what people need to know, Bryan, is that charter schools are public schools, period. They have to meet the same academic standards as traditional public schools. And oftentimes we are held to higher accountability standards. Teachers are subject to the same certification requirements. We don't just take people off the street and just throw them into teaching. And where possible, charter schools have and should more flexibility than some traditional public schools. So that's what people need to know, because there are a lot of myths out there. And one of them that I think is the largest hurdle to overcome, that I don't know if you'll necessarily hear it from, well, let me not say that. Let me just say it. There are and have been some very bad actors in the charter space, period. We just need to get it out there. We just need to say it. And there were some organizations, individuals, etc., where it was about economics and a dollar as opposed to children. Right. Us at Equity Now, there were a lot of other things that we could have chosen to do with our time and our money. Again, Natasha and I, our kids are 16 and 20, so we could have started a traveling business and been in Jamaica right now, right? Right. But we do this for the kids. We do this for children and families. We do this for individuals on the margin. We do this to teach. We do this for high accountability. We do this for legacy. There is inherently within me, because of the mentorship that I've had in my life, where individuals held a ladder of success simply for me to climb up it, at times to their own detriment, because they could have been climbing up right behind me, but they held it steady so I could come up that ladder. So it's built within me. It's running throughout my veins to be able to do the exact same thing as far reaching as I can. And that's what Equity Now and Legends Charter School is about.
Several things in there. Whenever somebody says to me that there's been bad actors in the charter space, the first thing that I think about is there's been great, good, bad, average, awful actors in the non-charter space, right? So there's this big thing around, we see something like the Atlanta cheating scandal, or we see something where a coach or a principal or someone commits fraud on the non-charter public side. And it's kind of like, well, okay, but overall, public schools are great. And I'm always kind of like, not so fast. I mean, we definitely have knowledge of awesome schools, awesome districts, awesome leaders, awesome teachers, and silos of excellence, right? But systemically, it's really challenging to think about motivations of the charter sector, how they organize, how they make sure to expand. And so I mentioned my experience at Matchbook Learning. We served the bottom 5% of schools in the United States at that time. And every school that we took over had a 1-year window of literally shutting down. You either improved or you got shut down. So somebody outside would say, well, you lost a school, you opened a school. What is your definition of success? And what I always say is like, look, that kind of accountability, there's been public schools languishing for decades that don't get that kind of scrutiny or get that kind of accountability push.
Exactly.
And so here you folks are launching this, and you've really got a vision not only for one school, but broadening your reach as well. How did you choose focusing on financial equity and making sure that you were really intent on closing that life gap for, I would assume the Black and brown life gap, but you may educate me for all. I'm just curious how you came up with that focus.
That's another great question, Brian. So a little selfishly, so I take no credit for the school design and curriculum. That is my wife, Sester James. She's an award-winning principal. We were, as co-founders, putting all of our pieces together. We talk about our superpowers and how can our superpower make a positive impact to our school design. And one of, I don't know if I would say, I've had some success in the stock market. So I brought to the team and I said, well, what if we had a conversation about closing the wealth gap as well as closing the achievement gap? And the team, because I do not have a team of bobbleheads, looked at me and said, okay, well, how do we do that? So we had to ideate, and they chose another side just to push back. So that would sharpen the ideas that we had. But I'm a long-term investor. I've been investing in the stock market since 1999. I probably didn't start doing it right until somewhere in the 2000s when I met my mentor. But we thought about if we had a school or a network that had rigorous academics, and then we added a curriculum that focused on financial education, we believe that our scholars would have the right to choose their path, right? Because oftentimes students get to graduation and they're kind of scared to tell their parents that I don't want to go to college,
right? Or
I don't want to go to college right now. So we said, how can we solve for that? So specifically being an investor in the stock market, I was hearing these the coin phrase financial literacy. And while I meant no disrespect to anyone who's using that term, I said to my team that we wanted to push past financial literacy and have a full circle of financial education. So every single kid that comes to a Legend school is pushed to get a stock portfolio. They're learning about the stock market. They're learning about interest rates. They're learning about checking and savings, but they're also doing a stock simulation, and then they're investing in the live stock market. There's indeed an inherent connection between economic well-being and education. And again, I don't want to talk about, folks on the margin in the sense of making it a black and white thing, right? Because the economy itself and how things are set up, whether we want to go into a conversation about capitalism, some of these schools are designed exactly how they're supposed to be: a factory to produce workers, a factory to produce folks who can come out and help with someone else's dream. But what we wanted to do was we wanted to ensure that we had full circle of financial education so they could have freedom in their decision making. If you choose to go to college, well, you started investing as a kindergartner at 5 years old, and you put $500 to $1,000 in every single year from birthday parties, et cetera. So now when you're graduating, possibly, back at a napkin math, you have $30,000 saved up, right? Now you make the choice. Do you want to use that $30,000 to start your business, incorporate your LLC, and do a trademark on your clothing line and then go to college for business. So now you're doing both. But we believe in designing a system where our scholars have freedom in their decision making.
Mm-hmm. You know, I see so many parallels to the work that we're doing at Winston-Salem State University, where we really have looked at the three pandemics of this past year, COVID, racism, and, you know, misinformation. So when I think about this conversation, some of the schools that were hit the hardest on COVID were schools that were underrepresented. Racism is not a new George Floyd thing.
Absolutely.
It's a thing that, you know, we have wrestled with as a nation and have not done our part to improve as a whole in the ways that, you know, we've been called to in terms of humanity. And then finally, with misinformation, education is the key, whether it's financial information, whether it's, you know, getting smart about opportunities and networks. One of the things that I love about what you're doing at Equity Now, and also what we're doing with Winston-Salem State University, is flipping that paradigm and saying, okay, well, how might we design together? I mean, you know, the Underground Railroad didn't happen just because Black and brown leaders were involved. It happened because all leaders and all backgrounds were involved.
That's right.
Things that are happening now, there are things that I can do as a white male where I cede my privilege or organize teams differently or reach out to different types of expertise so that we all bring those voices to the table. And I think that's one of the things I've always appreciated about you and your family, and I'd love for you to speak on a little bit, is how do we include all to solve these problems? Because we have to navigate a system that's inherently misdesigned or poorly designed, and we have to work our way through that. But what I love about what you're doing is you're kind of disrupting that and saying, well, that's true, and we want to give you a path to economic opportunity that can be your own as well. And I think it's that both and approach that's going to really get us to this next place as a country. And we'd just love to hear some of your perspective.
Thank you for that, Brian. So I think the very first thing that we need to do is stop nuking each other when we have a difference of opinion.
Yeah.
Right. We live in a democratic country, and it is okay to disagree.
Yeah.
Now, excuse me. Now, we don't necessarily have to talk about how we got here, but we know it is extremely polarizing right now.
Yeah.
And we could be having a conversation about, do you like peanut butter on the top of your peanut butter and jelly or on the bottom?
Yeah.
And it could turn out into an outright brawl.
Yeah.
Something as simple as that. So when you start having a conversation about traditional public schools and public charter schools, if we're fighting about peanut butter and jelly, those conversations are extremely heated. So we have to bring the temperature down, and we have to start listening to each other. We have two ears and one mouth. So we need to listen to understand rather than to respond, because oftentimes we get into the conversation and we're measuring who's smarter and who has a better opinion and who could be right, as opposed to coming into the conversation to find a level of understanding and common ground. Yeah. So when we have these conversations, even when we talk about the wealth gap, oftentimes folks will say, well, there's individuals in this country that had a 400-year head start. That's true. That's definitely true. But if that's how you start the conversation, how's it going to finish? Yeah. Yeah. While I understand that, I also understand and appreciate that trying to catch that 400-year gap is not my goal. Right. My goal is to put individuals on a wealth building journey. So if you'll sit down and have a conversation with me about what you, we, and I need to do to help children and families to get on that wealth building journey, and not juxtapose it to what has happened in the past, even though we can have that conversation. I'm not saying we shouldn't, but it's not where I'm starting from as a baseline. We know that. We understand that. I'm Black. I grew up in the hood. I'll never forget. I've seen a lot in my lifetime. But when I'm teaching these younger individuals, don't forget what happened, but also we're not going to base our goals solely on that conversation. Because if you do coming into those conversations, I was interviewed by a podcast, these two white ladies, they call themselves the Unqualified Coaches, to give them a shout out. And they said, Shomari, we want to talk to you about race because we just don't know. And that is the humility and the bringing down the level of the temperature to have these conversations that we need. The other piece to it, Bryan, is we have to fundamentally understand when you start talking about traditional public schools, they are like a McDonald's. And as authorizers, you're coming in with your charter school and you want to open up a Wendy's. And McDonald's is saying, well, why do you need square patties? We've been doing this for years. We do round patties. Why do you not put a piece of bread in between two circle patties? So in having that conversation where all the levels are down and we're not nuking each other, you need to understand that I need my autonomy because I have my ideas of how this is going to work. And I'm okay exchanging I'm okay exchanging high accountability for my autonomy. Hold me to the highest standards you want, but allow me to build this thing the way I know, believe, think, and can prove that it can work. So in order to move this thing forward, a lot of things forward, not just the charter space, but just collectively as a country, but specific to charter schools, we have to start with stop nuking each other, come into having these conversations with a level head, and understand that there are CMOs and there are charters that are out here doing great work with square patties.
Yeah. You know, so much there. If you and I did a audit of the number of superintendents in the country who are Black or brown, the number of principals who are, and teachers, it's not too long on that data trail from a representation, from an insight, from an experience, from a credential standpoint, that we would have really disproportionate numbers. So in comes a Black and brown owned CMO, and you folks are looked upon not only as Wendy's, but the added layer, right, of it's rarely done in a way that you're doing it. And so you have to encounter all of that in the design. And so when I hear, and in the execution, when I hear you roll that out and I think about a teacher or a principal or a superintendent who may be listening to this and saying, well, you know, how does this relate to me, or how do I begin it? One of the things that I think superintendents or any kind of authorizer or any kind of state leader needs to do is understand their data. What does their data look like now? And if they are underrepresented on committees, boards, design teams, authorizing teams, there's an active understanding from that data that should make you go, okay, now how are we situating the opportunities? How are we situating the pipeline? What's happening so that we can develop diverse slates? But it doesn't stop there. How many of those people were promoted? How many of them moved up in that district or in that charter network, right? So tracking that through line is a big part. But I want to double click on what you said about some of these critical race theory components that we both have been sharing over the past year with each other. You know, I look at something like redlining or the Homestead Act and I say, where was that in my history curriculum? And how is that connected to building wealth? So I think a lot of times when somebody hears what we're talking about, they think, well, these are two edgy business guys who are kind of trying to figure out how to create these economic opportunities.
Yeah.
That's a piece of the entire puzzle.
Yeah.
But it's also educating yourself on history so that as you encounter those obstacles, which, by the way, New York Times would say, if I'm married to my Asian wife and she goes in for credit versus if I go into credit, there's a different thing. Absolutely. If I'm measured to a Black or brown Hispanic woman, I'll get two different rates even today. Yes, so I want to make the connection for our readers and our listeners that, look, this hasn't gone away. We're talking about a different way of educating for it, and then creating this capacity in each other to say, hey, who can help me navigate this? Who's equipped me with the skills? And that's one of the exciting things about what you're doing. I don't want listeners to hear, hey, this is just about financial equity and financial wealth. This is about the whole process. So that's what I'm compelled by when I hear it, that you're actually setting up folks to make an array of decisions with their future in that $30,000. Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And what gets measured makes progress, right, Bryan? So we have to consider that there's multi levels and layers of key performance indicators that we should be taking a look at. And as a charter management organization, exactly what you just mentioned is what we need to take a look at. What does our board look like?
Mm.
And we can't be on the opposite side, right? So we can't have a 99 or 98% white board or black board, right?
Right. Right.
So we have to take those things under consideration as well. But going back to the autonomy piece, and when you talked about the curriculum,
Mm.
so you talk about social studies and the things that I learned when I was coming up
Yep.
and the framing of it.
Yep.
Whether we're talking about Christopher Columbus,
Mm.
or whether we're talking about Martin Luther King having an entire chapter and Malcolm X having 2 pages,
Right. Right.
right? So even when you break it down into the autonomy of what we are able to teach and how we are able to design it based
Mm.
off the facts, right?
Yep.
Because whose purview, what lens are you looking out of? And if I can give you another lens to take a look at this out of, maybe you'll have a different perspective, and maybe that perspective will be more warm and inviting to the conversation, which was to my earlier point about not nuking each other, because we are a product of our experiences. And sometimes we can't necessarily blame the ignorant. So we need to be able to educate them. So we have those conversations all of the time, Bryan.
Yep. I want to close with the future and kind of where do we go from here? You and I, every time I'm up in DC, in fact, shortly, we're going to get together and further this conversation. But I think, and I'm excited to finally tour the facilities and see how you guys have opened during COVID.
Thank you.
But the issues are like, if I'm a school district and I've got charters like in Durham Public Schools, it's pretty easy to go over to that finance office or that board office and see how many of those charters are white owned. Just that decision right there, right? Like if you've got 5 or 6 charters in your portfolio, 4 of them are succeeding and 2 of them are struggling, or 1 needs to be shut down. Hey, let's have that same standard for publics. Let's reorganize our school system. Let's make sure that we're dedicating the right resources to communities that need us, and
Equity.
those communities that, have a need for equity across the board.
Right.
And one of the places I see your work going, I'm curious your thoughts, is like when those kind of audits are done, it sure would be nice to say, well, in steps a black and brown operator, so that not only can that be birthed for an area of the community or a part of a lottery system that previously didn't have access, but hopefully smart superintendents, smart authorizers can learn and transfer some of those lessons across. So not trying to get into your business model, but I see one day where you're actually running training and outsource workshops to other charters to understand how to close the wealth gap. And then to your point, you folks are always open to, sure, bring us your ideas too, because we only get better because of those types of relationships.
Oh, absolutely. And I'm biased and lean towards our financial education from a financial education perspective. But to your point, deploying what we've learned, and let me say this first, so your listeners know and understand with the utmost humility, I'm not saying we do everything right.
Yep.
I'm not saying that all of our ideas work by any stretch of the imagination, but what we do is we fail forward. We don't have paralysis from analysis. We have our metrics, we measure them, we go in, we receive feedback because we believe in service delivery. So we're going to ask you, this is what we did. How did you feel about it? Did you like it or not? How can we improve? So I just wanted to say that so your listeners would understand that we definitely don't believe we do everything correctly, but we believe in taking simple steps expeditiously to solve for it, get that feedback to know how we can improve. But to your point though, because I digress, what we're doing with our what we call Legends Fellows program, they do the attendance, behavior, and culture. So we have 2 adults in the classroom. And that second adult, I give you a story. When I was a kid, there was only one teacher for 30 kids in the classroom. And that teacher, if I had a bad day, which may not have had anything to do with school, maybe I had an argument with my little brother before we left. He went off to his school, I went off to mine, and now I'm in school really ticked off, right? And now I'm bringing that into the school. Well, the teacher had 2 decisions. One, to send me to the office to be dealt with, to figure it out, who in most cases, the assistant principal or the person in the office wasn't equipped to deal with me. Or 2, stop the entire class from the other 29 students and deal with just Shomari. Now that's not fair. So we said, how can we solve for this? So our Legends Fellows program, where our 18 to 30-year-old individuals come in, similar to the AmeriCorps program.
Yep.
Very similar. They are in the classroom. They can see Shomari and they say, hey, Shomari, you having a bad day today? I can pull Shomari out of class now. And I can have a conversation with Shomari and say, hey, things not going well. Let's go for a walk. Let's have a conversation. Now, we don't expect that 20-year-old Legends Fellow to have a certification in counseling or therapy. So you know what we did? We hired one. So our director of social emotional learning is implementing to ensure that we have social and emotional competency throughout our network, not just with our kids, but also the teachers, the staff, and adults in the building. So those are some of the things that we're looking as we decide and we move forward with our network and start deploying our resources to other schools to say, hey, in our school, we ask the kids and we ask the adults, what zone of regulation are you in today? Are you green? Are you having a great day? Is it a good time to talk? Whether you're talking to a kid or you're talking to an adult, as opposed to just barging in to their office, or are you red, where today you just need to be left alone for 5 minutes? And, or Bryan, how can I help? So we have 4 fundamental mission focused areas. One is our K through 12 education, which is our Legends Charter School. And then 2 is our financial education, because we want to do our part to help close the wealth gap. 3 is our social and emotional learning, because if I'm having a bad day, it does not mean that those around me should have a bad day. So we want to teach social competency. And then 4, sustainability in agriculture. As much and as far green as we can be, let's teach it. Now that's also inclusive of, we may teach you how to make $1 million, but we also need to make sure it's a full circle financial education that you sustain that $1 million. So we're going to teach you sustainability. So yes, as we continue to grow, we want to be able to offer those services to other individuals, not even necessarily from a monetary perspective. Like I said, Bryan, there were a lot of other things that we could have done. We chose to get in this for children and families and those that are doing the work. So we're always open and willing to have conversations.
Awesome. So I have 2 final questions, and you raised them both in there, and we'll, I'm sure our listeners will want to dig in on both. Because I know you share my passion for Six Sigma and process improvement and all these tactics on how problems are solved. And, I was blessed to be around a lot of mentors in it. It's a way that I think, and I bet that's making its way into your work and how classrooms and workshops and staff happen. And what I'm amazed about is, when I bring on new team members at Setser Group, or I work with clients, they've never been exposed to it. They've been a part of a servant culture in education that is just, hey, we give everything we can all the time. We're not always worried about efficiency. We're not always worried about how we iterate. We just love kids and we wrap our arms around them. And nothing with that is wrong. But focusing that is a real challenge for today's leaders. And I'll go you one better. It's the very skills all of our kids are going to need. When my kids come up to me and they say, Dad, I don't know, or what, I always go, well, how are you thinking about it? why don't you boys go try a few things, then report back to me, right? I don't give them the answer. And I think that's a really important skill to build people and equip them with tools so they can solve any problem. So I'd love for you to just share for our listeners kind of, I know that's a strong piece of your personal work. How has it made it into the work you're doing?
Great question, Bryan. So first off, very difficultly originally, because we had to consider and be respectful that when you start talking about Lean Six Sigma and DMAIC, define, measure, analyze, improve, control, statistical quality control, right over some folks' head, and it can be way too much too fast, right?
Yep.
So what we did was, before implementing, going into design, we had conversations about what does it look like and how will it live? And a piece of that is honestly nomenclature, Bryan, to get folks to have an understanding and a level of ease with the conversation. So what I mean by that, I've probably said what gets measured makes progress 100 times so far since we've been talking, right? So Lean fundamentally believes in top down and bottom up. It's not just the management forcing it down your throat, but those who are not involved in the work will be naturally resistant to it. So how it lives for us is having a conversation about having a culture of continuous improvement. And then what does that look like for you? How can you make us better every single day? And then tying some of the language and the nomenclature that is already familiar. There's almost no difference functionally between a school improvement plan and Lean and Six Sigma, right? The point is, we want to identify, based off your mission, vision, core values, what actions are you going to do to improve? Yep. Now, if I don't say school improvement plan and I just say everything else in Lean Six Sigma terms, folks will be like, whoa, what are you talking about, Shomari? Yep. So very carefully and cautiously, we roll it out under very simple concepts such as plan, do, check, act. Yep. Right? Those are very simple concepts. Now, we understand that there's a very big difference between something being simple steps and being easy work. We would never say that this is easy work, but there's simple steps to get to where we want to be. So what we do here at Equity Now and Legends Charter School is foster an environment where folks can make mistakes and understand that we're in a process where our culture is about continuously improving. And I say to the staff all the time, I can't help you if you don't swing the bat. If you swing and miss, I can coach you on it. And one day you're going to swing and you're going to hit a home run. But there may be a day, there may be an inning that comes where every time you swing, you struck out. But if you never, ever swing, then you can never improve. Yep. And that's the epitome of Lean and Six Sigma. Let's take what we fundamentally believe in. Let's wrap that around continuous improvement. And let's put people in an environment where they can flourish and then help coach them to be great.
It's awesome. So the last one is a complicated one, but I want to build on the question you got from the two podcasters who were like, we don't know, or help us. One of the things I've been thinking about a lot as a white male over the past year is this notion of performative allyship, right? Like, I'm keenly aware that so far on the Setser Group Facebook Lives, we have been intentional about inviting diverse guests. And that intentionality is not, in my view, performative. It's about, I don't think lots of people are intentional. I think people regularly establish panels with their buddies and friends and don't really think like, okay, you also have buddies and friends of a diverse background, and how can you bring that to bear?
Sure.
But at the same time, there are things that I run into where full stop, I am just going to be clumsy, and I'm okay with that. I'm okay with saying something, pushing on something, and having my friends or colleagues check me and go, Bryan, are you sure you meant it that way? Or, you know, you might want to rethink how you're framing that, because I know you, and that's not exactly how you want to come across. And I think what I think is going to be important in the coming years is we want to get a lot of white support off the middle, off the fence, off the fear. This goes back to the no cancel culture comments you made earlier, and basically educate them that, look, you're going to be clumsy just like you would be clumsy with your white male friend or your white female friend around something that you might be talking about with women or something you might be talking about with parenting. Like it's no difference. Black and brown culture is not a monolith. Like they have the same nuances that all of us do.
That's right.
And it's okay to be clumsy. So, I say this for two levels of response. One is I'm curious how you value that conversation in the world we've been a part of, not only for the past year, but ongoing. Mm-hmm. How are you thinking about it as you socialize it with your scholars and your staff, right? Because I think we're all in this interesting place of navigating a world where inclusivity, I heard this great definition recently where like diversity was being, asked to the dance, right? And sort of, inclusive and equity was really about being asked to dance. And then sort of belonging was you dance and nobody cares, right? And so I may be butchering the quote, but it's this thing around how do we get to that kind of level where white people can take things like we talked about with Six Sigma and bring that to the conversation, but also be balancing that with new learning, new experiences, and new ideas, and basically name, hey, it's okay to be clumsy. Like we have a relationship, we're humans, and you don't have to worry about being perfect or being the greatest ally ever. What you need to worry about is getting into the dance and making others feel comfortable and being comfortable yourself. So just curious how you're thinking about all of that.
That's another great question, Bryan. So it's so multifactorial. There's so many nuances and so many functions. What I would say is, well, first off, I value it extremely. As you know, my friend group, the folks who I talk to are a full array. Like they are white, black, brown, Latino, it is Latinx. But I think here is what I'll say. This is my opinion. I guess this is all opinion based, but now you're really digging into my head now, where whether left or right, the extremists have taken over. And we don't, as I said earlier, have folks in an environment where they feel they can make a mistake. And meeting in the middle has become a bad thing largely when you have these conversations. Either it's this way or it's this way, or you don't care about me because what comes after it. So now you're qualifying your belief that you're imposing on me. So a part of it is those who are believed to be sensible have conversations with one another to start to shift this narrative. I'm hesitant to mention some of the movements that have been going on, but I fundamentally don't necessarily agree with how they go about the change that they're seeking, because it's very off-putting, not just to those who you are trying to bring to the team, to bring to the dance, but even those who are at the dance. So in order for us to have a conversation, Bryan, I have to be able to allow you to feel comfortable when we sit eye to eye and knee to knee and have these conversations. And then when and if you say something that might be offensive, well, then it's, hey, Bryan, this is what you said, and this is how it made me feel. Right? Because you can't tell me, regardless of how you meant it, how it made me feel. And as long as we can have a conversation about that, and then now you've learned something from me and you've learned something from that experience, well, then now, hopefully, when you go out and you're having those conversations in other rooms in front of mass crowds, You've learned from that experience, and now it has changed how you respond, how you say that. Or maybe you started with a preface to say, hey, I was having a conversation with my buddy, and my buddy is this black guy up in DC, and this is what I said, and I totally offended him, and he didn't, get up and punch me in the face. That's where we need to get to. It's very difficult for me to ask you to be an ally if you feel that at the moment you say something wrong, I'm going to nuke you. So we all have to play our part for the betterment of the culture, for the betterment of just being human beings. At the end of the day, you cut us open, we all bleed. Right? We put our pants on the exact same way. So I value it extremely. I will say that I am in a space where I don't know how we're going to come out of this, because folks are going into their corners more and more and putting a wall up and saying, here is where I am and you can't budge. So I think we can do the work to move forward, having these conversations, which is one of the bold and reasons why we said our name is Equity Now. We want to expedite change immediately. So you want to join us about expediting change, whether you believe in traditional public schools or public charter schools. If you want to create change for children and families, our name is Equity Now. No matter what you look like, come see us, because we want to make change now. And again, that lives throughout Equity Now, and it lives throughout Legends Charter School. And it's not necessarily something that you teach. It's the experience. It's the conversations. It's eye to eye, knee to knee, sitting down and saying, this is how I feel about what you said. So equity, inclusion, and diversity are a really big deal. But those who look like me have to also understand that we can't be in a position of cancel culture, because we'll never be able to pull individuals to our side. And that's probably not even the right way to say it. We'll never be able to have a conversation with individuals about being support for what we believe in if at a moment's notice someone makes a mistake, we cancel them.
That's great. That's great. Well, I know we're up against time. The one thing I would say in reaction to that is a debt of gratitude for always being able to have the conversation, because I think, one quick story would be, I wrote a college paper about the Kennedy assassination and the coverage in the media. And I recall that it took a long time for that information to get out. It took a long time for that information to be sanitized, to be broadcast in a time when we could all hear it. Fast forward to today, when we can hear about anything instantly and shape opinions in a matter of seconds. And so one of the things that I think you're doing there, and we're certainly trying to do at Setser Group, is like, okay, you saw that on your phone, or you saw that in what you read. Now let's think critically about what it means, and what does it mean for you, and what's your role in sort of moving forward on that. We had an opportunity the other night as a family to watch a rather forgettable movie called Stowaway that just came out. And one of the premises is they go to outer space, two white females and an Asian man. And about midway through the movie, they find a black man who was walled up in the spaceship. And he's not a trained astronaut. He's obviously startled. He got knocked out, and now they have to deal with provisions and kind of who lives and who dies. So one of the interesting facets is the immediately when he woke up, okay, I started leaning over to my wife and I'm like, oh boy, this is going to be dangerous, because he doesn't know like where he is. And she turned to me and she said, what do you mean? What do you mean it's going to be dangerous? And I said, no, I don't mean because he's a black guy. I mean, because if this were a white guy, Asian guy, like he's in a totally foreign environment and he's hurt and he may react badly and they're in a dangerous situation. That little course correction of, well, I don't mean because he's black. I mean because he's in a new environment and he's an outlier, right? What I've seen over the past year that gives me hope is that people are committing to learning. They are committing to conversations. they are pausing. Social media, for all of its ills, is forcing people to go, let me clarify, or let me go the extra step. And I think your scholars are seeing that. I think our clients are seeing that. I think the students we interact with on college campuses or K-12 are seeing that. That's got to count for something, because in past generations, it was either not talked about for various societal norms, or it was overt and never anybody called upon it. And now we're really having the conversation. So this whole thing you're talking about with corners of the world, what I notice is if you're over, say, 60, maybe over 70, you have a move towards authoritarianism. So before we even get to race or gender, you tend to be a law and order person. You tend to be a right and wrong person, regardless of your background, right? Like you just get more solid to those types of views. And so what I've tended to do with relatives or parents or friends in that age group is just kind of go, well, let me ask more about that, or let me reframe that, or, well, you could think of it like this, and not challenge their corner, but get them to just pause for a second on being absolutely certain, because our world is not that. And I know both of us really care about equipping people to deal with that uncertainty and to give them some tools to do it. So really appreciated having you on today. We're going to be sharing this with our listeners in its entirety, but also sharing it with our listeners around very specific aspects of the conversation, and in hopes that you'll have similar ones with your teams, with your partners, and with the folks in your network. So thank you for the time today, Shomari.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate you.